So anyways, with that, let's turn to the book of Job. Now, if you were with us last week, you know that we looked at the book of Job from a literary structural standpoint, which is about as exciting as it sounds. But when you look closely, Job is in 42 chapters, and the first 2 chapters and the last chapter are written in prose, and the chapters in between are all written in poetry. And so the dominant structure, the dominant form of the book of Job is in fact a poem, and we often forget that Job is poetry. And so today we're going to look at the first of the 4 sections that are in the poetry of Job, and it's a lot of chapters. So we're going to do the best we can to cover all of it because I really want us to get around the big idea, our heads around the big idea behind this first section of poetry that is the main point of this book. Now, if you were to speak to most Christians and ask them to tell you the story of Job, and in particular, what happens during this poetry, I think most Christians would tell you something like this. Well, in the first 2 chapters, Job suffers, and then from chapter 3 to 39, we hear about how friends show up, and they tell Job to curse God and die. But Job refuses to curse God, and Job holds on to his faith, and God blesses Job's faithfulness. And today, the application of this story is that you should be like Job, which sounds great, and it sounds nice, and it sounds applicable. There's just one problem. This is the exact opposite of the actual content in the book of Job. And it's amazing to me how we've taken this story that is found in the book of Job, and we've changed it to be the opposite of what it's telling us it actually is. So how do Christians, myself included for the majority of my life, go from reading a book and coming away with the opposite conclusion and intent of what the author intended for us to hear? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to the historical context of the book of Job. Now, what we don't know about Job is specifically where it came from because the book doesn't really reference any historical events. But most scholars place the date of Job sometime between the 5th and the 8th century BCE. The reason for this is because when you look at the most traumatic events in Israel's history, that happened in the 8th century and the 6th century BCE. The first one was the Assyrian invasion of 722. This was a devastating conquest in which Israel was left in ruins. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel were pushed to the brink of extinction. Then about 150 years later, Babylon from the east came in, leveled Jerusalem, and they took the majority of the survivors back with them to Babylon and forced them to live as Babylonians in exile. These 2 were the most formative, important events in Old Testament history, and most Christians are unaware that they exist. Now, to give you an example of how important these events are to understand, I'd like to bring in a biblical scholar named Peter Enns, who is a brilliant author. And he talks about the importance of specifically the second event, the Babylonian exile. He says, if I stood on a table covered in syrup with my hair on fire, I still couldn't draw enough attention to the importance of the Babylonian exile. Which scholars don't write this way that often. He really wants us to understand that this whole event changed the way that people perceived and understood God. Not only that, but you can imagine between these 2 traumatic events in their history, there were a lot of theological questions that arose shortly after them. So after the conquest of Assyria, after Assyria came in and leveled Jerusalem, what happened was theologians and authors started asking the question, why did God allow the Assyrians to conquer us? I mean, if God is all powerful and all loving and we are God's people, then God shouldn't let the Assyrians kill us. About 150 years later, in Babylonian exile, theologians, teachers, authors, priests began to ask the question, how did we end up living in exile? Because God is the author of all, and God didn't accidentally let us end up in exile, right? And so because of that, historians began telling the story of Israel's history. You can read about Israel's history in 1st and 2nd Kings, and you read over and over again kind of the same thing that comes forward from this story. Time and time again, our kings chose to worship other gods instead of Yahweh. We are living in exile because of our leaders' infidelities toward Yahweh. So basically, historians were telling the people who suffered through the conquest as well as Babylonian exile, you want to know why we are suffering? It's because of our historical lack of commitment to religion. Now, of course, historians would write this because they were hoping that ultimately people would hear these stories and say, oh, if we get another chance, we are going to recommit to Yahweh. We're going to double down on religion. If God would just restore us, bring us back to Jerusalem, then we will become really focused on God and we'll take our religion seriously. But you had more than just historians telling this story. Because if you look at the Assyrian conquest in 722, you also have prophets talking about how much the people of Israel missed the point. To give you some perspective, here are the prophets of Hosea and Amos, and what they write about what happened is really rather stunning. Hosea says essentially this: Israel is a whore that continually cheats on God. Now, if this sounds misogynist and sexist to you, I will tell you you're right. It is. This is what happens when you don't let women write the Bible. Men come away with these horribly sexist, misogynistic metaphors. Now, Amos is a little more sensitive, but he ultimately delivers a similar message when he says, Israel is so deprived that it tramples the poor into the dust. And they are essentially saying the same thing. God is punishing us for our faithlessness. We brought this suffering upon ourselves. This was the dominant theological idea, because if God didn't want us to suffer this way, then God would not have allowed it to happen, because God is all-powerful. Now fast forward 150 years and you have two different prophets, Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Ezekiel tells us that Judah is a whore who continually cheats on God, which once again is sexist. Jeremiah tells the people of the temple, God abandoned us because we did not care for the poor. In other words, 150 years later, they're saying the same theology that was in circulation before. God is punishing us for our faithlessness. We brought this suffering upon ourselves. And so you can imagine that after hearing this theology for centuries, there are people who are living in Babylon who are tired of hearing how they are to blame for the suffering they are enduring. In fact, it's almost like somebody stands up and says, enough, enough. I hear you pastors, I hear you teachers, I hear you historians, I hear all of you telling me that I'm the reason we're here. I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story, and I think this represents how we feel. And it's either here or shortly after the Assyrian conquest that someone begins to tell the historians, tell the theologians, the story of Job. And Job is different than the other characters of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Because Job chapter 1 verse 1 begins with these words, there once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. So in other words, there's this author who is tired of being blamed for the suffering that he or she is enduring. And so he tells a story about how someone who is blameless, who has not made a mistake, ends up suffering. And when you consider that this story is mostly centered around poetry, we can place a stronger emphasis on metaphor and symbolism than we could if it was written in prose. And so for that reason, the character of Job is a metaphor for Israel. The character of Job is about what happens to Israel between 722 and 586 BCE. And the thesis of this poem is, not all suffering is deserved. It's possible to be innocent and suffer. Now, if you were with us last week or you know the story of Job, Job then sets out after we're being told that he is blameless, and within just a few verses, after being told that he's rich and powerful and has healthy kids, he loses everything. Wealth, sons, daughters, hope, land. He loses it all. He's under attack in just a few moments. And while this seems almost comical how quickly he loses everything, when you compare it to Israel's history, you say, oh, can you imagine going along, minding your own business, and then the Assyrians show up, and in an instant, you lose everything. So after Job loses everything, he blesses the name of Yahweh. He says, I will stay faithful to God 3 friends show up after he's struck with a terrible illness. These 3 friends can barely recognize him, and the 3 friends sit in silence with Job. And after 7 days of silence to think about what God has done to Job, Job says, enough with the shallow blessings. I'm going to tell you what I really think about God. And in chapter 3, Job curses the day he was born. He ends that curse by saying these words, "My worst fears have happened, my nightmares have come to life, silence and peace have abandoned me, and anguish camps in my heart." Now, after Job speaks, after 7 days of silence, the 3 friends begin to speak in response to Job cursing the day he was born. Now, we have to remember that these three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, are ultimately very prominent in this story. They have full chapters where they speak. And Job is a metaphor for Israel, which raises the question, what do these 3 friends represent? Well, there's no question that these friends are the villains in the story. And whatever it is that you believe about Job or whatever it is that you talk about Job, the overwhelming consensus is that these 3 guys are trying to get Job to not be the hero of the story. But what do they represent? And when you look closely at their words, which we'll do in a minute, these friends who are the villains of the story are a metaphor for religion. And the truth of Job is that religion is the villain of this story and of this poem. And when we ask the question, how is it that we come away with the opposite understanding of what the actual content of the book of Job is? It's because religion tells the story. And religion doesn't want you to know that religion is the villain in Job's poem. To give you an idea of how religion is the villain, we're going to go into each of these 3 different perspectives from these 3 friends and what they say about Job and his state of suffering. We first hear from a man named Eliphaz. And Eliphaz really lays it all on the table so we can see the symbolism plain and clear. He asks the question in the first stanza, can an innocent man be punished? Well, up until this point, until Job's author is writing this poem, the overwhelming answer of consensus is no. Innocent men don't get punished. So he says, can an innocent man be punished? Can a good man die in distress? He then turns to Job and says, Job, if I were you, I would pray. I would put my case before God. God's workings are vast and fathomless. God's wonders beyond our grasp. You are lucky that God has scolded you. So take God's lesson to heart, for God wounds, but then binds up. God injures, but then God heals. When disaster strikes, God will rescue you and never let evil touch you. In war, God will save you from bloodshed. In famine, from the grip of death. You will know that your house is protected and your meadows safe from harm. You will see your family multiply, your children flourish like grass. You will die at the height of your powers and be gathered like ripened grain. I know that these things are true. Consider them now and learn. Well, who does Eliphaz sound like to you? Because to me, Eliphaz sounds like the church in America today. The church who responds to suffering by saying, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. I know it's difficult to see this now, Job, but just have a little more faith and hang on, and you'll see that God will make all of this work out in the end. Another favorite saying of the church that I hear in Eliphaz's tone is, God will never give you more than you can handle. God is testing you, but God is compassionate because God will not give you more than you can bear. Job hears Eliphaz's theology and reasoning, and he responds with some very poetic words. If ever my grief were measured, or my sorrow put on a scale, it would outweigh the sands of the ocean. That is why I am desperate. Look me straight in the eye, Eliphaz. Is this how a liar would face you? Can't I tell right from wrong? If I sinned, wouldn't I know? Job insists that he does not deserve this pain. And no matter how good it's going to get later, there is no amount of goodness later that can justify the suffering that Job has gone through now. And after speaking to Eliphaz, Job then turns to God and speaks directly to God. When I lie down, I long for morning. When I get up, I long for evening. All day I toss and turn. Won't you give me time to swallow my spit? If I sinned, what have I done to you, watcher of men? Why have you made me your target and burdened me with myself? Can't you forgive my sins or overlook my mistakes? For soon I will lie in the dust. You will call, but I will be gone. After all of this suffering, Job is angry with God. And why wouldn't he be? Job lost everything. Job's had to bury his children. Job has lost any sense of security. And so Job hears Eliphaz trying to placate him, trying to keep him happy, trying to say, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. And Job's like, it's not okay. I've lost everything. And he expresses anger toward God. Now, Job's second friend, Bildad, hears Job's anger toward God, and he responds with a poem of his own. He says, how long will you go on ranting, filling our ears with trash? Does God make straightness crooked or turn truth upside down? Your children must have been evil. God punished them for their crimes. God never betrays the innocent or takes the hand of the wicked. And you know who Bildad sounds like to me? Bildad sounds like the church. Bildad sounds like the church saying, the love of Jesus never fails. Everything happens for a reason. And sure, that reason was that your kids were bad, so they deserved to die. But hey, at least we have a reason. God is still just at the end of the day. Now, Job, who's had to bury his kids, may I remind you, hears these words from Bildad and responds very directly. He says to Bildad, I am guiltless, but God's mouth condemns me. Blameless, but God's words convict me. God does not care. So I say, God murders both the pure and the wicked. Whew! These are some strong, strong words from Job. To say that God murders people, and while we may rush to comfort Job and say, no, that's not who God is, Job would look at us and say, tell that to me about my kids. He then goes on to say, when the plague brings sudden death, God laughs at the anguish of the innocent. And we have this idea within Christianity that Job clings tightly to his beliefs. But when you look closely at this, Job is all of a sudden saying that God is a murderer. Job doesn't cling tightly to his beliefs in this poem. Instead, Job clings to his innocence and his children's innocence. And why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he? People are telling him that his kids deserve to die, and he is angry about those words. After hearing Bildad's objections, he turns to God for a second time, and he says to God, you lash me if I am guilty, shame me if I am not. You set me free, then trap me like a cat toying with a mouse. Why did you let me be born? Why couldn't I have stayed in the deep waters of the womb, rocked to sleep in the dark? And after all of this suffering, Job begins to question, for possibly the first time in his life, whether God is in fact good. Now, hearing this questioning really upsets Job's third friend, a man named Zophar. Zophar cuts into this arguing or this anger with God or this questioning with God and says, how can you understand God or fathom God's endless wisdom? It is higher than heaven. Can you reach it? Deeper than hell. Can you touch it? God's wisdom is wider than all the earth, broader than the breadth of the sea. If God seizes and casts in prison and condemns, who can stop God? For God knows that you are a sinner, Job. God sees and judges your crimes. But a stupid man will be wise when a cow gives birth to a zebra. Come now, repent of your sins. Open your heart to God. And you know who Zophar sounds like to me? The church. The church telling its congregants, it is not our place to question God. Our place is to trust and obey. And yes, I'm throwing shade at him, and I make no apologies for that shade. Job hears Zophar saying, you can't question God. That's off limits. And he responds very curtly, be quiet now, Zophar. Let me speak. Whatever happens will happen. I will take my flesh in my teeth, hold my life in my hands. God may kill me, but I won't stop. I will speak the truth to God's face. Listen now to my words. Pay attention to what I say, for I have prepared my defense, and I know that I am right. Job wants a confrontation with God because he believes he can win an argument with God. And while that may seem bold, remember how much Job has suffered. Job is not interested in placating God anymore. Job's only desire is to speak honestly with God. And if God won't grant Job that audience, then Job would rather die. Job sees all these other human beings just telling God about how great God is all the time, and he says, "It doesn't work for me anymore." After that, Job turns to God for the final time in the first section of this poem, and he asks God to grant him just one thing. He says, "Grant me one thing only, and I will not hide from your face." Now, we assume that Job is going to ask for a cure from the illness he is experiencing, that he will ask for some release or reprieve from the suffering he is enduring. But instead, Job says to God, "I only want one thing. Accuse me. I will respond, or let me speak and answer me. What crime have I committed? How have I sinned against you? Why do you hide your face as if I were your enemy? Will you frighten a withered leaf or hunt down a piece of straw? For you count up all my errors and convict me for the sins of my youth." Job is accusing God of being a bully. And what's really interesting about this whole story and the way this poem unfolds is that you have to remember where we came from in chapter 1. Because in chapter 1, the author tells us that Job every day offered a sacrifice to God, asking for forgiveness. Now, that's a strange thing to do because Job, we've already been told, is blameless. He doesn't make mistakes. But here he is still offering sacrifices for forgiveness. Why? Why is Job offering these sacrifices on a daily basis? Well, when you look closely at why Job is doing this, it's because he's offering it just in case one of his sons or one of his daughters might have accidentally sinned. And so Job offers these sacrifices to God, hoping that God won't notice a sin and retaliate with vengeance or even worse, violence. And so Job offers these sacrifices, but he offers them from a place of fear. Job is terrified that God will all of a sudden take these things away. And then guess what happens in the poem? God takes everything away. And after all of this suffering, Job is no longer afraid of God. Job says, "Bring it on, God. Stop being a coward and hiding behind your silence. Come out into the open and accuse me of what my sin is that deserves all of this punishment." And the real transition of Job's character or Job's story is that Job goes from being terrified of God to speaking about as boldly and as unafraid and unabashedly toward God as humanly possible. And when I read these words from this poem, I have to tell you, I find them incredibly moving. This movement from God speaking, or from Job speaking to religion and debunking all of these trite, superficial answers, and then calling God out and saying, "It's not fair for you to sit around in silence while I try to figure out what I did wrong." In this poem, the reason I find it so inspiring is because it's a poem about how God betrays Job. And when you consider the historical context of what this whole poem is trying to really talk about in a bigger picture, in this poem, God is betraying Israel. And these poor Israelites heard from time and time again from the religious people, "Oh, you've brought this on yourself. You're suffering because you're not devoted enough to God." And along comes the author of Job and says, "I'm tired of this. Let me tell you what I think this actually is. I'm tired of hearing from you guys about how I'm to blame for the pain that I'm enduring. How about instead, God is the one to blame for not helping us out right now?" And if you've ever felt like God can do something about a situation, and God, for whatever reason, remains silent, then all of a sudden this poem speaks to you today. Because we are in the midst of a pandemic. And when we look at this poem that was written 2,500 years ago, I think it speaks volumes to me today because in this poem, God betrays humanity. And Job is a metaphor not just for Israel, but anyone who has suffered. Now, upon saying these words, the church would quickly charge in and say, no, we can explain. God's not betraying us. There's something else here. Let's go and look closely at what's happening because we can tell you why this is happening to us. And the reason religion wants to tell you why this is happening to us is because religion loves answers. Religion loves answers, right? To give you an idea of how much religion loves answers, The Guardian just yesterday posted the results of a poll asking U.S. Christians what they thought of this pandemic. According to The Guardian and this poll, 2/3 of U.S. believers see COVID-19 as a message from God asking us to change something about our behavior. So in other words, religion says, no, God's not betraying us. God is punishing us because we're not as devoted to God as we could be. And as soon as you hear that today, and as soon as you read the book of Job, you should say, didn't we address this 2,500 years ago? Because here was Bildad representing religion, telling a father who is grieving, who has buried 10 children, your children must have been evil. That's why God's not betraying you. Your children betrayed you because they were so evil. That's why God had to kill them. And while you can dismiss this, we have to admit that this is an answer. This is an answer for why God acted the way that God did. But let's be more honest about it, shall we? Because religion loves answers like Bildad's answers, but they're terrible answers. They're awful answers. The idea that God would put all of us through suffering, through this pandemic that is just impossible to keep up with, is a terrible answer. That God is trying to get our attention? If that's the case, why doesn't God, who we profess is to be all loving, show up and just tell us what we need to change? It's not fair for God to ask us to mysteriously change something about our behavior and just kind of figure it out, right? And the reason I love this poem so much is because it speaks about how God betrays humanity. And the whole reason we moved the book of Job up to this month was because we felt like Job speaks about our experience now in this pandemic more than any other book of the Bible. And you know why that is? It's because I feel this on a personal level. As your pastor, I have to tell you, I feel betrayed by God. And I know pastors aren't supposed to say that, but that's because religion tells you that pastors aren't supposed to say it. And I want to tell you about how I feel betrayed by God. A few years ago, about 4 years ago, in fact, we were part of a young adult group. This was the genesis of Paradox Church. And I talked about this a few weeks ago. And when we were a young adult group, we were essentially removed from the church that we were serving at, and we were told that we couldn't meet anymore. Well, we started making plans, and eventually we started through prayer, feeling like God was calling us to start our church on our own, to start a non-denominational church, which was Paradox. And 10 weeks later, from December 12, 2015 to February 20, 2016, we met for the first time as Paradox Church. Now, this is really significant to me because 10 weeks ago today was our last service together. The last service that we could meet in a building, and we didn't do this remote kind of church service. So if the gap between Shadow and Paradox was the same as this COVID gap, then that would mean that today is the day that we would be meeting in person again. And it makes my heart ache that we can't be together. I know, I just don't feel like I'm asking for a lot from the Almighty for us to allow us to be in the same room together. And I look at these 10-week gaps and I think about how hard it was to write this sermon, about how this was weighing on me in the back of my mind. And the question that comes forward is, why is God putting us through this again? Why do we have to go through this distance again? And I have to tell you that when I consider the gap that we have between us, and the space that we have between us, and the suffering that we're enduring, and we can't be together in the same room, I feel betrayed by God. I do. Now, you may be going through much harder things in your life. You may be feeling like this is really petty. I would encourage you not to view suffering as a competition. But I have a feeling that you probably feel betrayed by God as well. Maybe you've lost your job and you don't know which way is up and which way is down. You don't know what your next move is. And you're thinking to yourself, man, if God actually existed and doesn't choose to do something about this, then that's nothing short of a betrayal. I feel betrayed by God. Maybe one of your loved ones has been affected by COVID-19. Maybe even worse, they've passed away from it. And rather than saying goodbye to them in person, you've had to say goodbye to them over FaceTime. Well, what is that? I would argue it's nothing short of a betrayal by God. And all of this uncertainty and fear and anxiety that we're feeling could all be solved by God that we profess is all above it all, that is all powerful. But we're stuck here, aren't we? And so when we say the words, I feel betrayed by God, it's hard to really rebut that. One option is to walk away from God and to profess that atheism is the way forward. And if you are atheist or agnostic, I would just say, well, I would feel betrayed by life. Why is life allowing this to happen? And there are people who would rush in with answers and say, well, it's because of our leadership. It's because we were too prideful. It's because we had too much hubris. It's all these things. That's just going back to what Job was trying to debunk 2,500 years ago. And so when we as a community say together, we feel betrayed by God, we all of a sudden come across this book. And if Job was our guest speaker today, and we could ask him a question, and we say, Job, I don't really have a question. I just have to tell you I feel betrayed by God. I think Job would look at us, and after a long pause, just look at us and say, me too, man. Me too. And the book of Job is really, really valuable to me and really helpful to me because Job doesn't give us answers. Because any answers that can justify the suffering of a global pandemic are probably going to be terrible answers, right? Instead, Job gives us companionship in the unresolved mystery of our suffering. And when I think about what that value is, to read his story and realize it's included within the faith, I realize that this betrayal that I'm speaking of out loud is not a betrayal of the faith, but is very much a part of the faith. And it reminds me that our faith's purpose is not to offer answers to other people. Instead, it's to offer companionship when we encounter suffering that is beyond explanation, that is beyond answers. I think it's important for the church to be less concerned with answers and more concerned with companionship. And so when I read the poem of Job, and particularly this first section, I think it's a reminder to us to be Job in this world. May we offer companionship to another in the unresolved mystery of our suffering. And may we also accept companionship from another in the unresolved mystery of our suffering. And through the midst of all of this uncertainty, may we somehow have eyes to see and ears to hear and to see and embrace Jesus Christ in all.